An area once called Dunkley's Grove was considered for a new stadium for the Chicago White Sox, not in old-timey days, in 1986. Was Edison Park named for Thomas Edison? Dunton, Sagone, Hartford, and where was Cleaverville? Today we're discussing Chicago's forgotten towns, neighborhoods, and names, Part 2. I'm Tommy Henry, and this is the Chicago History Podcast. I did one of these episodes a few weeks back, and the response was so strong, I thought I'd give you a few more. Some of the info about a few of the areas mentioned today I've included in other stories, so if one or more of these sounds familiar, congrats, you've been paying attention. Let's get to it. 4 miles southeast of the Loop is Community Area 36, also called Oakland. Roughly 1 mile square in size, it is bounded by 35th and 43rd Streets, Lake Michigan, Cottage Grove, Pershing, and Vincennes Avenue. Of course, it wasn't always called this. Samuel Ellis, born in 1790, came to Chicago from Massachusetts in 1831 and helped defend Chicago during the 1832 Black Hawk War. In the late 1830s, Ellis purchased more than 135 acres of property along the lakefront south of Chicago's city limits, developing the land for farming and the construction of homes. Ellis also ran a successful tavern where present-day 35th and Lake Park Avenue intersect, and donated a wedge-shaped portion of his land to the city to be used as a public park. London-born Charles Cleaver left England when he was just 18 years old, arriving first in New York before continuing on to Chicago in October of 1833. Just 2 months earlier, Chicago had been incorporated as a town with 350 people. It was a hard winter, with flour prices so high that, according to Cleaver, quote, it was considered a luxury rather than a necessity. To provide for his family, Cleaver would ride his horse out near the present-day Fulton district and, with a rifle, spend the day hunting wild chickens that roamed the area. According to Cleaver, in an interview he did later in life, in 1835 he built the first house on Chicago's west side on Kinsey, just west of the river. It stood alone, Cleaver explained, the only other building on that side of the river being a little shanty between it and where is now Lake Street Bridge. Charles Cleaver explained that in the spring the house could not be reached without wading through, quote, mud and water belly deep to a horse. Cleaver lived there for 3 years, then built a house at the corner of Jefferson and Washington Streets. In 1838, he married Mary Brooks, whose father was one of the first justices of the peace in Hyde Park, then an unincorporated area south of Chicago's city limits. The couple would go on to have 6 children. Charles Cleaver was already a successful businessman by the early 1850s as a manufacturer of lard oil, soap, and candles, with a business that employed 45 people, shipping products to Chicagoans at a yearly value worth $8 million today. As great as that was, Cleaver wanted to build a large soap factory, and for that he'd need space. Seeing potential south of the city, in 1851, Cleaver purchased 22.5 acres of swampy ground from Samuel Ellis near 38th Street and Lake Michigan. He then bought 71 acres of land from the Graves family. Cleaver built his residence, which he named Oakwood Hall, on the property. He had a vision to create a community for his factory workers and began developing the area. He laid out streets, built houses, and even constructed a meeting house in 1854, which became not only the first church in Hyde Park, but also the first church in the area built south of Van Buren Street. Cleaver invested heavily in the area's development, spending $60,000 in 1 year on building projects. Another of Cleaver's moves was to pay the Illinois Central Railroad $3,800 annually to provide train service to Cleaverville, effectively making it one of Chicago's first commuter suburbs. A September 1855 newspaper article claimed that 10 acres of land south of Chicago, formerly occupied by the poorhouse, would be used to establish the city's first reform school in Illinois. The goal was so that, quote, the young culprits who are increasing at a fearful rate in the city may be properly cared for, not only for their own sake should they be placed under salutary restraint, but in order to prevent their corrupting other children who fall under their influence, who would otherwise grow up honest and industrious. Reverend D.B. Nichols, later called the father of the reformatory school movement in Chicago, was superintendent of the reform school from 1854 until 1860 and guided it to much success. After a fire gutted the reform school in October of 1856, it was moved to the packing house of Charles Cleaver's soap factory, not far from the burned buildings. In 1866, a general meeting place called Cleaver Hall was built at 40th and Grand Boulevard, now called King Drive. The name Cleaverville was in use until 1871 when real estate developers subdivided the area and renamed it Oakland, so named for the number of oak trees that lined the streets. The area was gradually annexed into Chicago, with part joining the city in 1863 and the remainder in 1889. Some of Cleaverville's street names are still in use today, including Cottage Grove Avenue, named for a cottage in a grove of trees, Oakwood Avenue, inspired by Cleaver's estate name, and Ellis Avenue, commemorating Samuel Ellis. Charles Cleaver died in October of 1893 at the age of 79. His death did receive mention in the newspapers, but was overshadowed by the assassination of Chicago Mayor Harrison Carter, discussed in episode 305 of this podcast. Cleaver's funeral was held at St. John's Reformed Episcopal Church at 37th and Langley. Now, I got to stop right here for a moment. I often trip myself up while researching these episodes because I see the thing about St. John's Church and think that can't possibly still be there. Then I go on a deep dive to find out what happened to the church, and since I did, you have to sit through it, or skip ahead 15 to 30 seconds, maybe a full minute. Between February and the end of May 1900, 4 Chicago churches experienced mysterious fires that started in their organ lofts. One of these churches was St. John's Reformed Episcopal Church on the southwest corner of 37th and Langley, across the street from one of Chicago's oldest green spaces, Edison Park, named after settler Samuel Ellis. Unable to use the burned-out church, the congregation moved to a small building on Center Avenue near Taylor Street, where Center Avenue was renamed Racine Avenue. In 1908, the French Evangelical M.E. Church purchased the property formerly occupied by St. John's with plans to repair and enlarge it. One of the last mentions I could find of the French church, or any church, on that corner was in April of 1917 while the First World War raged on. In a section of the Chicago Daily Tribune called Chicago in the World's War, readers learned that M. Bartholomew, French consul here in Chicago, spoke, and Mademoiselle Jenny Defoe, former Grand Opera singer, sang at the church. Bartholomew praised President Woodrow Wilson in his stand against Germany, and Reverend A.L. Allais said in his sermon, Christ was crucified by the enemies of liberty and independence, but liberty and independence were not crucified. Charles Cleaver is buried in a family plot at Oakwoods Cemetery. Cleaver Street at 1432 West from 1126 North to 1458 North is named for Charles Cleaver. North and slightly west, about 26 miles outside of downtown Chicago, is the village of Wheeling, Illinois. Wheeling is pretty straightforward, with its name transferred from Wheeling, West Virginia, and its post office established in May of 1837. But what about West Wheeling? Born on October 29, 1788, a stonecutter named Asa Dunton moved with his wife and 6 children from Oswego, New York, to an area west of Chicago in March of 1836 in search of quality land on which to farm. Recognizing the excellence of the soil and the advantage of well-draining higher ground, Dunton decided to file his claim on the open prairie. Dunton bought 3 land claims, one for himself and one for 2 of his sons, William, 17, and James, 14, with each claim for 160 acres of land. In 1847, Asa Dunton built a clapboard house on his land claim. Asa Dunton would eventually build a house at what is now 612 North Arlington Heights Road, which still stands today as the oldest home in Arlington Heights. One of Dunton's sons, James, resided in his father's home until James's marriage in 1849. James built his first home at 623 North Arlington Heights Road and lived there until he constructed a 3-story home at 619 North Arlington Heights Road just before the Great Chicago Fire. According to the book Prairieville, USA, The Story of the Birth and Growth of a Prairie Village by Daisy Paddock Daniels, published in 1971, one story handed down was that many locals on the flat part of the roof at the rear of James Dunton's home watched the conflagration in October 1871, 22 miles from the scene of the blazing city. The first post office in what would become Arlington Heights was established in February of 1854 as West Wheeling. William H. Dunton planned to name his land Bradley after his good friend Peter Bradley, but soon discovered there was already a town in Illinois near Peoria called Bradley. He then settled on Dunton, also the name of the local train station on the Illinois and Wisconsin Railroad, in May of 1861. As the name Dunton did not convey the proper level of attractiveness of the community, the town's name was changed to Arlington, then Arlington Heights, in March of 1874. The official incorporation of Arlington Heights as a village occurred in 1887. Here's a fun West Wheeling story. In September of 1856, a man in West Wheeling hired Eli Bagley to paint his house, for which Bagley would be compensated with $50 and a horse once the job was complete. Bagley then borrowed the horse, claiming he needed to travel to Chicago to get supplies. Once in Chicago, Bagley sold the horse and fled to Columbia County, Wisconsin. Authorities were sent to arrest him and return the horse, which they did. Bail was set at $500, nearly $19,000 today. William H. Dunton, considered the father of Arlington Heights, died in 1886 and is buried in the Wheeling Township Arlington Heights Cemetery. In addition to Dunton Park, there is a statue honoring William H. Dunton that stands at the corner of Arlington Heights Road and Northwest Highway. Edison Park on the city's northwest side is number 9 of Chicago's 77 community areas. It was originally called Canfield, a station on the Illinois and Wisconsin Railroad. While the origin of the name Canfield is unknown, it is thought it was either based on that of an early settler in the area or the nickname for the railway platform where local farmers left milk cans for delivery. Part of the area would later be called Ridge Lawn, while another section was called Roseneath, which author W.H. Stennett, who wrote A History of the Origin of Place Names, connected with the Chicago and Northwestern and Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha railways. Hold on, I need to catch my breath. Published in 1908, called, quote, a fanciful manufactured name that was supposed to assert the place was buried in roses. On May 10, 1890, the area was rechristened Edison Park, highlighting its new status as an electrified community. Developers went as far as to send Thomas Edison a letter about the new town's name, to which he responded, giving his blessing. Special trains left Chicago 4 times daily, free of charge, destined for Edison Park, so that those interested could see Chicago's new banner community. One newspaper ad touted Edison Park's, quote, good substantial improvements, natural drainage, a beautiful depot in the center of the park, and undulating surface. How pleasant it would be to have a nice home of your own in a beautiful, healthy suburb, where after your day's toil is over, you can ride in about 30 minutes away from the smoke and foul air of the city to a place where the air is pure and everything is cheerful. By 1910, Edison Park's 300 residents desiring city services annexed the village to Chicago. In the fall of 1833, two Englishmen, Hezekiah Dunkley from Hillsborough, New Hampshire, and Mason Smith from Potsdam, New York, arrived in Chicago. 5 days later, they traveled northwest of the city on a 20-mile trail of flat, grassy marshland and prairie. They eventually found a large grove of trees located on the eastern bank of a river which would later be called Salt Creek. After staking their claim near where Irving Park Road and Wooddale Road intersect today, they got to work cutting down trees to construct log cabins. As it was the custom of the day to name a grove after its settler, the men chose to call it Dunkley's Grove. Within a few years, more residents moved to the area, building homes, churches, and schools. In 1837, 30 settler families lived in Dunkley's Grove. The early 1840s saw a jump in population, and by 1844, there were 200 people living there. More businesses were established, including a general store, a cobbler's shop, a blacksmith, and a steam grist mill. The area's name was changed to Addison in 1845 after a town in England, or possibly Addison, New York. Other sources claim it was named for Joseph Addison, the 18th century writer and co-founder of the magazine The Spectator. Addison was incorporated as a village in 1884 with a population of 400. Addison has a long tradition of education and culture. In 1864, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod moved its teacher training to the village from Fort Wayne, Indiana, and established a Lutheran Teachers Seminary. After nearly 50 years in Addison, the institution moved to River Forest, Illinois in 1913, where it became known as Concordia Teachers College, now Concordia University, Chicago. The former seminary buildings were sold to the Lutheran Children's Welfare Society. A monument recognizing the site of the Lutheran Teachers Seminary was erected in 1924 by grateful alumni, made from windowsills and steps from the seminary. A plaque on the site was presented in 1982 by the daughters of an 1889 alumnus. The monument can be found today at 100 West Lake Street near Addison Village Hall. Now then, let's talk Chicago White Sox. In 1986, there was talk by team owner Jerry Reinsdorf of moving the team to Addison, Illinois. Other markets considered for the White Sox move in 1986 included Phoenix, Denver, Tampa, St. Petersburg, Florida, and Washington, D.C. A July 9, 1986 piece in the Chicago Tribune titled "It's Addison or Adios" detailed a press conference about the home of the Chicago White Sox, Comiskey Park, which engineers claimed was, quote, near the end of its useful life. There was an effort to negotiate with the city for a new stadium south of the Loop, but those plans stalled when the legislature adjourned its spring session without forming the necessary city-state stadium authority. Whether the team would be able to keep Chicago as part of the White Sox name if they moved to Addison, then Mayor Harold Washington said, "No way. Chicago is Chicago. The border is pretty well known," Washington said during an impromptu chat with reporters. "If you go beyond the border, you can't take nothing with you." Team owner Jerry Reinsdorf responded by reminding the overflow crowd of reporters that the New York Jets and Giants kept their city's name after moving to New Jersey. "Addison isn't Iowa," Reinsdorf said. "Addison is Chicago as far as I'm concerned." He said that as many people live within 20 miles of Addison as within 20 miles of Comiskey Park at 35th and Shields. While talking with reporters, Reinsdorf indicated that the 47,000-seat open-air stadium planned for Edison would cost about $105 million to build, nearly $303 million in today's dollars, plus $15 million in surrounding public works. The city stadium would have cost $135 million, Reinsdorf said, and require $55 million in surrounding public works. In 1988, then-Governor Jim Thompson acquiesced to the White Sox demands, request. And on June 30th of that year, the Illinois legislature passed a bill approving a $150 million subsidy for a new White Sox stadium. The White Sox built their new stadium next door to their old stadium, and nearly 30 years later are once again trying to get state subsidies to build a new stadium in the South Loop. If you're looking for traces of Dunkley's Grove in Addison, there is a restaurant on Lake Street called, appropriately enough, Dunkley's Tavern. Homewood, located 22 miles south of downtown Chicago, is bordered by Chicago Heights and Flossmoor to the south, Hazel Crest to the west, East Hazel Crest and Harvey to the north, Glenwood to the east, and South Holland to the northeast. Originally called Hartford, it was named for James Hart, who established the site in 1852. The Illinois Central Railroad established a stop there in 1853, calling it Thornton Station, which created confusion as there were already a few other Thornton stations in the area. Yet somehow they waited 16 years before changing the town's name and the station name to Homewood in 1869. The name was suggested by a local woman after Homewood, Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh. In DuPage County, roughly 21 miles west of downtown Chicago, lies Itasca, a village first settled in 1841 by a doctor from Boston named Elijah Smith. The first post office in the area was established in 1846, using the name Bremen or Bremen after a German city of the same name. Bremen was a quite popular name for communities back then, with numerous ones, including Bremen Township, southwest of Chicago. Those in the Tinley Park area of a certain age likely remember the long-gone Brementown Mall and Brementown Theaters on the southwest corner of 159th and Oak Forest Avenue. Just 4 years after the first post office was established, the town's name was changed to Pierce in May of 1850 for Smith D. Pierce, an early postmaster. 3 months later, another name change, this time to Sagone, S-A-G-O-N-E. The name Sagone lasted until September 1873, when it was mistakenly changed to Ithaca. 1 month later, it was changed to Itasca. Now, while Itasca may sound like a Native American name, it is a manufactured name. When the Chicago and Pacific Railroad connected through town, Dr. Elijah Smith chose the name for Lake Itasca in northwestern Minnesota. Two explorers named William T. Boutwell and Henry Rose Schoolcraft thought they had located the source of the Mississippi River in a lake in Clearwater County, Minnesota, southwest of Bemidji. Schoolcraft gave different and often conflicting accounts of how the name was created. One account was that it was from the Ojibwa word totosh, meaning a woman's breast. Village settler Elisha Smith parceled 80 acres of his land into lots in 1873. Train service to Chicago from Itasca began in April of 1875, and within 3 months, there was already trouble with unruly passengers. In July of 1875, a group of roughly 20 men boarded a Chicago and Pacific Railroad freight train at nearby Roselle, Illinois, headed to Chicago without paying their fare. The men, who had been working in the flax fields in Roselle, were taken off the train at Itasca, the next stop on the route. As the train began to leave the station, the angry men, referred to as roughs in the papers, began throwing stones at the train cars, breaking windows and terrorizing the paying passengers, who were forced to crouch between the seats away from the windows to avoid being injured by glass and projectiles. The train was stopped, then reversed toward the rioters, who scattered. With the help of several passengers, employees of the railroad were able to capture 8 of the roughs, who were taken to jail in Elgin. 9 others were captured between Itasca and Chicago and sent to jail in Chicago. The Chicago and Pacific train went bankrupt in just a few short years, replaced by the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad. This last one is mainly for my pal Zach, who grew up in Belleville, Illinois, roughly 17 miles southeast of St. Louis, Missouri, in St. Clair County, Illinois. Sure, this is far outside the Chicago area, but I found this one super interesting. A few notes on St. Clair County. St. Clair County's history dates to 1790, when it was organized as part of the Northwest Territory. It is the oldest county in Illinois, established before Illinois became a state or even a territory. St. Clair County was originally much larger, extending from the Illinois River to the Ohio River. The county was named for Arthur St. Clair, who was the governor of the Northwest Territory at the time. Early settlements in the county included Cahokia and the Turkey Hill Settlement, founded in 1798. The town that caught my eye while doing research for this episode was a small town southwest of Belleville that is long gone, except for a road named after the former settlement of Roachtown. Circa 1820, a man named Frank Roach, spelled R-O-A-C-H, built a primitive corn mill in the area. Frank's son Samuel and grandson Matthew built a mill on a nearby fork, which washed away the same year. The father and son Roachmen built a new frame building grist mill in 1864 on the same property as Frank Roach's mill. The new mill was 1 story with a basement. Frank Roach lived to be 106, and when he was 102, he reportedly went with a grandson to a local Belleville store and challenged the store owner to wrestle. A killing occurred in Roachtown in August of 1875, involving drinking and guns. I'll hold for gasp. Here's the story. A group of 6 men spent their Sunday drinking at a local saloon. By evening, talk had turned to marksmanship. 38-year-old Alfred Kiefer, an engineer at a local mill, bet the other men that he could hit a piece of paper from 80 yards. The bet was accepted by George Seafried, a married farmer with 7 children. The prize? More beer. The distance was marked off, the paper was placed on a tree, and Kiefer fired his shot. When Seafried informed Kiefer that he had missed the paper, an argument broke out. Seafried informed Kiefer that if he didn't honor the bet, he was, quote, a damned liar. Kiefer, who by then had reloaded his gun, told Seafried not to repeat that again. When Seafried reiterated it while advancing, quote, in a menacing manner, Kiefer fired his gun at Seafried, hitting him in the right side. Seafried threw up his arms and, after exclaiming, "My God," fell to the ground dead. Alfred Kiefer then traveled to Belleville and turned himself in to authorities. The trial of Alfred Kiefer was held 2 months later in Belleville, with a number of prominent local farmers put on the witness stand to testify to Kiefer's good character. The jury deliberated overnight, and at one point, 8 of them voted for hanging. When they returned in the morning, 38-year-old Alfred Kiefer was sentenced to 14 years in the state penitentiary at Joliet. Roachtown was apparently big enough to have its own baseball team. A game in May of 1882 between the Star Club of Roachtown against the Milstead Energetic Club resulted in the Roachtown team's loss of 33-1. News reports claim that there were many in attendance that day, and other than a few mishaps, including a wild bat that struck a player in the side of the head, fun was had by all. While some sources claim Roachtown had faded into history by 1901, I found newspaper articles that went beyond that year. In 1902, the Belleville newspaper, the Semi-Weekly Advocate, reported that the young son of a Mr. John Hammond was severely injured after being kicked by a mule. Fortunately, the boy was attended to by a doctor from Millstad, the next town over. A man was arrested for stealing 17 chickens from a woman who lived near Roachtown in 1906. Mr. and Mrs. Peter Wessel of Roachtown welcomed a daughter in 1912. 1925 was an odd year for Roachtown. In June, a man living at 500 South 2nd Street in Belleville pleaded guilty and was fined $15 for shooting frogs out of season near Roachtown, as frog season did not start until July of that year. Then in August of 1925, a severe thunderstorm passed through the area, destroying a large barn on the farm of a Roachtown resident. Several tons of hay were also lost. In a neighboring town, a mule standing under a persimmon tree was killed when it was struck by lightning during the same storm. The last substantial, and I'm using finger quotes here, mention of Roachtown I found was in 1935 when an election was held for director of Union School District 164, where there were 61 qualified voters. Only 60 voted, but for some reason 2 of the voters failed to mark their choice for either candidate. The incumbent was reelected, defeating his opponent 30 to 28 votes. Oh, one last one. A 2010 ad for AT&T touting the nation's fastest 3G network has St. Louis covered, includes a map that clearly shows Roachtown. While most of the earliest buildings of Roachtown are long gone, the name of this small town lives on with Roachtown Road, which runs from Illinois Route 158 down to Highway 47, which appears to be in unincorporated Millstad, Illinois. With its various cornfields and other agriculture, I can't help but wonder if any sign of the old mills are still evident in the area. If you know, please reach out to me. Thanks for listening to today's episode about forgotten towns, neighborhoods, and names, part 2. As always, if you have any questions about anything covered today, anything to add, or have an idea for a future episode, I'd love to hear about it. Send me an email at chicagohistorypod@gmail.com. I have links to various books and other information about this subject if you'd like to learn more. Anything ordered through those links, not just the items listed, may earn a small commission for the podcast and help offset production costs at no cost to you. Check out the Chicago History Podcast social media pages, including Blue Sky, for articles and pictures related to this episode and past episodes posted throughout the week. The art for the Chicago History Podcast used on these social media pages was created by John K. Schneider. Thank you very much, Johnny. Send him an email at angeleyesartjks@gmail.com. I will be back soon with more stories from Chicago's history. Until then, get out and explore when possible. Learn more about whatever city you live in, and stay safe.